You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, a podcast by some guys who were at one point set on doing philosophy for a living, but then thought better of it. Our question for episode 181 is something like, how much can people be blamed for their actions when the whole system they're a part of is corrupt? And we read Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil by Hannah Arendt from 1963. For more information and a link to the text, please check out partiallyexaminedlife.com. This is Mark Linsenmayer, vitamin P deficient in Madison, Wisconsin.
This is Seth Paskin, frog-throated in Los Angeles.
This is Wes Alwan in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
This is Dylan Casey in Middleton, Wisconsin.
Do you remember what vitamin P is from the text?
No.
I was just reminded of it just because it's on page 1. It is what the Israelis call protection in government circles and the bureaucracy. I also there was a good phrase somewhere in here, a bicycle rider. Do you remember what that means as a slur? You're such a bicycle rider.
I do remember the saying. I don't recall the meaning.
It means you kowtow to your superiors and kick your subordinates.
Ah, that's right. Yes.
Really? It feels a little lost in translation there.
It does seem to not reflect well on bicycle riders. I don't know if I'd want that association. Can we make it like Segway riders or something like that? Something that will impugn a group that we have less sympathy to than the healthy, environmentally conscious bicycle riders. So why did we read this? Wes, you suggested it at the time that we did. Tell us what immediately prompted that.
Well, what immediately prompted it was that there was an article in the New York Times about a neo-Nazi, I guess is the right way to put it. It was a profile of a neo-Nazi as sort of an ordinary guy, going with him on a trip to the grocery store and documenting his family life and things like that. And it produced a lot of outrage along the sort of lines that we're very used to seeing these days. So there's talk of normalizing being a Nazi and humanizing Nazis and how there's something wrong with that. And then I noticed that if you got on Twitter or you looked around for any conversations about this, people were sort of preemptively arguing against the whole banality of evil angle, So if the author of the article had said, look, I'm just illustrating the dangers of this sort of thing. It's actually your next door neighbor, no matter how normal and how nice they might seem, might have these sorts of opinions. And it's worth knowing that. I saw comments to the effect that, well, yes, we all know about the banality of evil and we don't need to be reminded of that. I don't think many people talked in detail about Arendt and the banality of evil, but I know I had seen articles to the effect that it wasn't really properly understood. And I know we wanted to do some more Arendt. So I really wanted to get into the details of just what she meant by that and whether our popular conception of that is a misunderstanding.
Well, Seth, you said you'd read this a couple times before. Do you want to give us some background or your experience with the book?
Okay. Well, I read it of my own volition, I want to say when I was still in college. And then I read it again when I was in graduate school. And then I read it once more, maybe about a decade ago. Part of it was out of my own curiosity, being Jewish and sort of part of my own intellectual engagement with my quote-unquote tradition or my history. But the other part is that I seem to recall that during the 1980s, when what constituted a classical education or the classical canon came up, so Bloom, right, when Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind, this book was part of the conversation. And it was part of the conversation because it was written by a woman who was also a philosopher. It was part of the conversation because it was controversial in its time, because the theses challenged kind of our standard understanding of what constituted normal. It was also part of a curriculum that I followed for a couple of years around Holocaust studies. And so it has a tremendous amount of interest. And as we saw from our previous Hannah Arendt readings, she's also a tremendous writer, a very sharp thinker and social critic. And so I wanted to engage with the book, I guess, for my own edification. It's also one of those things where, at least in my circles, the title itself, Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? What is it? A study of the banality of evil. That phrase is a cultural touchstone for us. It's a meme in our culture, and I wanted to understand what that meant. I liked it as much this time as I have every other time I've read it.
And am I right that when this came out, it was very controversial and condemned by some Jewish groups that it wasn't taking the Israeli line. It's a report on the trial of Eichmann that took place in Israel. This is after Nuremberg. He couldn't be found for Nuremberg. He was hiding out in Argentina. But when the state of Israel was very firmly established, he was found in Argentina and they kidnapped him and brought him to trial. And this is Arendt's commentary, originally written for The New Yorker, but then expanded a little to make the book on how the trial went. But it doesn't really go into detail. We don't hear the statements of a lot of the witnesses or anything. And it's fairly critical of the way, in particular, the prosecutor, as representing Ben-Gurion, the prime minister of Israel at the time, his reasons for having the trial. She characterized it as having aspects of a show trial. Not that it was a sham, that the verdict was already determined beforehand and, that it was just purely she really was complimentary of the judges really trying to restrict themselves to administering justice to this individual. But certainly the amount of evidence that was admitted, there was a lot of purposes ulterior to simply finding the guilt of this one person. It was meant to be presented to the world that Israel can do this thing, has the jurisdiction, has the independence. Finally, the Jews can have a nation to prosecute based on their interests. And then also to remind young Jews and everybody else of exactly how horrible the Holocaust was. It was pro-Zionist, that Jews need to be militant in resisting this kind of thing in the future. And that, in fact, the Zionists who had been taking this harder line earlier on. So it was kind of critical. And then some of what we read was, in fact, mischaracterizing Arendt's positions regarding some aspects of Jewish resistance or Jewish collaboration with the Nazis, etc. But despite that initial controversy, am I right that this is more, as you say, Seth, kind of part of the conversation now, that this book is actually revered as a necessary, actually understanding that somebody like Eichmann was not terribly uncommon, that he was not like a sadist out there making his own law, that he was just a cog in the machinery, that's actually a really necessary lesson that we need to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, she wrestles with a couple of parallel themes. And for the listeners, this is it's a long book, but it's not a difficult read unless you have trouble with the content and the stories about, what was happening. So, she's making the point that the purpose of a trial is to determine the guilt or innocence of the person on trial. And in that respect, Eichmann's guilt as a participant had been firmly established and documented because this was 12 years after the war, is that right? That he was kidnapped? So, she's making the point that the purpose of the trial was not to determine whether he was guilty or innocent. The purpose of the trial was, just as you said, to make a statement to the world, specifically that immediately after the war, when the Nuremberg trials happened and some follow-on trials of war criminals, they took place in the countries where those crimes occurred and were adjudicated by, in the case of Nuremberg, the International Tribunal of the Victor Nations, and in the case of the follow-on trials, the legal systems inside of the individual countries. And at the time, the Jews didn't have a state. So they weren't in a position to actually have a trial themselves and meet justice, as it were, against any of the perpetrators of the crimes against them. So she was claiming the purpose of this trial was not to determine Eichmann's guilt. The purpose of the trial was to show the world that Israel had the right and the ability as a state to have this kind of a legal proceeding to accomplish the same task that the Nuremberg trials and the other trials did. Now, that having been said, with respect to Eichmann in particular, he was somewhat different than the people who were tried at Nuremberg because he was not a high party official. He was not a general. He was not a Reichsminister or anything like that. But the perception was that he was the mastermind behind the final solution. And what she does in the course of the book is point out that, A, he was not the mastermind. He wasn't in a position to make those kinds of decisions. In fact, just as you mentioned, Mark, the issue was that he just did what he was told because he was trying to advance his career. And it was this sense in which he divorced his moral faculty or his conscience from what was actually occurring. The two issues are, one, that individuals can do this, but more importantly, that an entire civilization, namely Western civilization, did this very thing. So the collapse was not, he was only indicative of the collapse of the entire moral order, first in Germany and then of the entirety of Western Europe, Eastern and Western Europe. The Eastern states, once they started collaborating with and then ultimately were annexed by Germany, they more than enthusiastically participated in sending their Jews off to the gas chambers as well. And the Western countries that knew that this was happening didn't take actions to stop it immediately. And so her question in this book is, how do we understand the complete collapse of 2,000 years of development of culture and morality as personified by this one person, and identify that the collapse itself is due just to the fact that people refuse to think or are unable to think?
Yeah, there's a defect in Eichmann's thinking in particular, specifically his, what she calls his inability to think from the standpoint of someone else, which we should get into later. I wanted to back up to her problems, which is the bulk of chapter 1, House of Justice. So her problem with the very idea of a show trial and the very idea of raising these larger questions, even though she addresses them in the book, is contrary to procedural justice in the strict sense. So she says, so I'm quoting from the chapter 1 now, justice demands that the accused be prosecuted, defended, and judged, and that all the other questions of seemingly greater import of how could it happen, and why did it happen, of why the Jews, and why the Germans, of what was the role of other nations, and so on, be left in abeyance. So moving down a little bit, on trial are his deeds, not the sufferings of the Jews, not the German people or mankind, not even anti-Semitism and racism. Whereas she says the case itself, the trial, was built on what the Jews had suffered, not on what Eichmann had done, which in her mind is a deviation from the question of justice. And then there's another great metaphor she uses. A trial resembles a play in that both begin and end with the doer, not with the victim. And if he suffers, he must suffer for what he has done, not for what he has caused others to suffer. So I wanted to sort of emphasize that assumption of hers because I think it will probably conflict with the intuitions of a lot of listeners these days. We discussed a very similar thing on the Nussbaum episode, which is to say that justice, strictly speaking, is not about victims. It doesn't exist to satisfy victims. It used to be, right? It used to be more tribal in that sense, or based on an honor system, let's say, where if you had hurt someone or killed someone, their family might take vengeance on you or something like that. It was built more on the model of individual vengeance. But in this case, justice is there to meet the demands of society, which aren't necessarily the same as the demands of the victims.
Yeah, and I wanted to also emphasize that characteristic of it being a report. She talks about this in the postscript, which is written after the first edition is done, where she sort of reflects a little bit on the reception of the book. But in some ways, to me, the brilliance of the book is that it is a report of things more or less directly related to Eichmann and the circumstances of his guilt and thinking about what kind of man he is and how he came to be. And in that way, there's a lot of facts in the book. And in fact, it's all the more horrible because of all the facts. But it's not a giant eye view of big topics like how did this happen to the Germans, or how did the Germans do this, or Jewish history, or anything like that. And to the extent it has psychology in it, it's really thinking about Eichmann's psychology.
Yeah, she does say that the trial, it was an opportunity to understand Eichmann and his motivations and the implications of those motivations. And by making it a show trial and making him a monster, it passed up that opportunity. And so she takes that opportunity in this book, and it's, of course, something that created a huge controversy and got her in a lot of trouble. The 1960s variations of, people accusing her of normalizing the terrible and the atrocious. And
yeah, I didn't find myself feeling it was very normalized, but maybe it's a different time. I'm far enough away from it. It was one of the most horrifying things I've ever read in my life.
Yeah, the same reaction. It's actually was very difficult to read for me and very depressing.
Yes. Thank you for that holiday reading there, Wes.
Yeah, right.
I gave up pretty early in terms of actually reading it, and I had to get an audiobook because I just knew that I wasn't going to be enjoying this book enough to like just power through it during my vacation. So by getting it an audiobook and listening to it at 1.5 speed, I was able to get a pass through.
There's just something so wrong about that.
But there are large sections of it that are of historical interest, but are not chock full of philosophy.
So I found the history fascinating and addicting, really. And I actually had trouble putting the book down, as depressing as it was.
I think you, as a philosopher, if you really wanted to get at the nub of this, just a couple of the chapters, just the beginning and the end. And there's a couple of chapters in the middle about the final solution itself. So chapters 6 through 8, I would say, would talk more directly about Eichmann's sense of responsibility or lack thereof. So chapter 8 is called Duties of a Law-Abiding Citizen, where he even name drops Kant and the fact that he was consistently doing his duty and even is able to give to the judge. The judge kind of follows up on this, some version that sounds accurate of the first formulation of the categorical imperative, right? That he was not undermining the society in which he was a part. He was not like a thief who, if everybody stole, then property wouldn't be possible. No, he was within his environment. He claimed that he was doing his duty the best that he could. And in fact, they point out that he was not just following orders. This is, what was claimed by a lot of the Nuremberg defendants. And, there's some of that in here, but a key point in the plot. So there's a lot of discussion of the logistics, the structure of the German government at the time, and how the expulsion of the Jews worked differently in different countries. Like a lot of that, as far as the philosophical content, you could skip. But getting at this particular incident where Himmler, his immediate, 2 levels superior to him, had, as it was becoming clear that Germany was going to lose, ordered that the final solution stop. And at this point, Eichmann went against the explicit orders, sort of on the grounds of what would the Fuhrer actually want.
What was his true duty?
Yes, what was his true duty? So he was like, being super zealous in following his duty by going ahead with some additional deportation. Even though the trains were all broken down, he ordered some marches of, so this is like the thing that he was kind of most directly responsible for in terms of his own initiative. He wasn't just following orders and wasn't claiming that.
I should say, I think that chapters 2 through 7 are also they're focused, principally on Eichmann and Eichmann's motivations. And I see chapter 8 as sort of a climax before she goes into many of the details about deportations in chapters 9 through 13 before coming back to the trial. We're focused on the trial, but the climax here is that regardless of what you think about Eichmann having been a cog in the machine, there's a certain point in 1944 when his boss, Himmler, his boss's boss, let's say Himmler, is basically saying, break off all the sending of Jews to extermination camps. We got to stop this. We got to think about how we're going to negotiate with the Allies once they take over, because everyone had seen the writing on the wall. And I think the way it's characterized in this chapter is not that Eichmann was going above and beyond what Hitler wanted. He was going above and beyond what Himmler wanted because he was reading what the Fuhrer wanted. And so there wasn't a lot of paper trail. There wasn't a lot of evidence of Hitler explicitly putting it down as a law that you shall deport Jews to the extermination camps. But for Eichmann, he kind of everyone knew what Hitler wanted, and they acted on that. And even after everyone else had stopped acting on that, he continued to act on that principle. And that's the sense in which he thought of himself as a Kantian, following his duty even after everyone else had stopped following their duty, and was simply thinking pragmatically about what was going to happen after the end of the war. And one of the interesting things, by the way, when he's asked to formulate the categorical imperative, or I think he actually just does it spontaneously, he accurately characterizes Kant's categorical imperative, and Arendt's analysis goes underneath that to say, well, he's not acting on the categorical imperative as such, but this bastardization of it to mean act in such a way that the Fuhrer, if he knew your action, would approve it.
Yeah, we should clarify that the thing that he was most involved with, the thing that he was accused of, was transportation, that he didn't run any of the camps himself.
He was directly responsible for one camp, the Theresienstadt. Is it?
Theresienstadt, yeah.
Yeah. But that was sort of a show camp for the Red Cross, and the most privileged Jews went there. It wasn't a regular camp, but he was actually technically directly responsible for that one camp. It wasn't an extermination camp or a work camp.
They made clear that it wasn't just the fact that he couldn't be found, that he wasn't tried at Nuremberg, because some people were tried in absentia and sentenced to death. So he was just not in the position where he was so obviously directly responsible. So a lot of the argument was, well, you were in charge of transportation. You knew what would happen to these people if you successfully did your job and transported them, expelled them to where they were going. So that's enough to make you responsible, even though, he tells a story about how he was shown around one of the death camps and he couldn't take it. He did not have a strong enough stomach for this. This is, of course, just his words. Who knows if this is actually true, but he, from the beginning was willing to confess, according to Arendt, quite a lot, and was just like, isn't that enough to hang me? Like, I'll hang myself in public if you want. Like, it's fine. Which I find a little hard to line up with his reaction, which I watched on this PBS special, Wes, you'd sent around, about the trial itself, and it shows part of his, at least reports on his words after he was convicted. He was convicted of all the counts. And he said, this is a travesty of justice. And so he wasn't at that point willing to just like, oh yeah, I was involved in something evil. I sure should die for that, which is how Arendt characterizes him, as at least how he behaved in the interviews before trial.
Yeah, she makes note of the fact that there's a conflict between what he said before trial, the comment about hanging himself, and then his feeling at the end of the trial, which is that it was an injustice. She mentions his plea for clemency. So, in the beginning, he was sort of had a braggadocio about repentance is for children and blah, blah, blah. And then he writes this plea for clemency, which was sealed actually until 2016. So I actually went online and read that plea for clemency. And it's the same sort of thing. I didn't do these things. I wasn't responsible.
He didn't pull any triggers.
So he was really responsible for different things at different times during the war. In the beginning, it was so-called emigration. Jews were
forced immigration.
Scared, of course. Well, forced immigration is a different stage. So early on, it's still forced. You're right, Seth, in some sense, because it's based on fear, but he facilitated emigration.
And worked with Zionists. He respected the Zionists in terms of, the Jewish question, the Jewish problem means they can't live here anymore. And so here the Zionists are coming forward and saying, have them come down to a new state down here. And so he respected those people, according to his words, and actively worked with them to try to
and even went to visit Palestine and learned a smattering of Hebrew and thought of himself as a Zionist, read the landmark Zionist text, which, of course, all of this is part of his blindness, right? There are people who are fearful and they're being persecuted, and that's why they're emigrating in large part. Some of it is straightforward Zionism or it's a mixture, but he thinks of himself as doing a good deed here. Later on, it becomes forced deportation and concentration of Jews in ghettos for the purpose of deporting them to other areas in the future. And then in 1941, 1939, really things begin. But explicitly in 1941, it becomes the final solution where he knows he's deporting people to death camps, basically. And there's no doubt he didn't deny knowing that. He knew what he was doing. When he put people on trains, he was sending people to their deaths. So that's the sense in which he was implicated and involved. So when in the beginning of the trial, his plea is not guilty in the sense of the indictment. And Arendt reflects a little bit about what that means. And for his defense lawyer, Servatius, it means Servatius wants to make this argument that in a way, these are acts of state. They weren't illegal under Hitler's regime. And so Eichmann can't be prosecuted for something that wasn't essentially illegal. For Eichmann, it just means that it was aided and abetted murder, that he wasn't the actual murderer. And that was a very important distinction to Eichmann. And that was the sort of thing that had him feeling like this was all a great injustice. He never actually went up to someone and shot them or pulled a lever to release gas or something like that.
I guess one of the things that Arendt was criticized for was essentially spreading the guilt around, that it wasn't just the German soldiers and German citizens, and she considers, could he have made a defense that if he hadn't gone along with this, his life would have been in imminent danger, and concludes that that's not the case, that there are actually plenty of officers that it would have been a matter of switching to a different high-paying job. It was just a matter that success was defined in that structure as doing what Eichmann was trying to do.
This is one of the most interesting parts of her discussion and his psychology, making the point that, that defense, that within the Nazi regime, it was so brutal that anybody who participated in it, if they deviated, they would be considered traitors. And strung up or killed. Or essentially, they were pulling a trigger because they had a gun to their heads. And she makes the point that, as Mark just said, that is simply not true, that you could just refuse to participate. You could get a transfer. You could say, well, I don't like this kind of work. And there's this kind of deeply horrifying aspect of it just being a corporation. And if you didn't like doing some of the work, if you didn't like working downstairs, you could just transfer somewhere else. And in Eichmann's case is that he had a sense not just of duty, but of bureaucratic achievement. And he wanted to excel and get the accolades of excelling as a bureaucrat. That's why he didn't want to leave. He wanted to do a good job and get promoted and make a little bit more money, and was irritated about not getting promoted, and would essentially stand around the water cooler and talk to people about how he deserved to get another promotion.
Yeah, the words he uses are at that idea that he quit his job basically and take another job, which would ultimately mean a demotion. But as Arendt mentions, there's no evidence that anyone was ever imprisoned or executed for saying, I don't want to be part of an execution squad, or I don't want to be part of the bureaucratic mechanisms that are getting millions of people killed. There's no evidence that anyone was ever punished. But anyway, he thinks of it as, quote unquote, inadmissible. And nobody acted that way, says Eichmann. And it would be unthinkable to quit his job. What's really interesting about all that is Arendt makes a lot of the fact that, look, Eichmann was this lower middle class guy. He had been basically a traveling salesman, and he got that job because of the connections of Jewish members of his family. And even that wasn't going well. And sort of being a Nazi was sort of the first, other than being a Freemason, which didn't work out, it really allowed him to start over and start a successful career. And for him, just a taste of that, pursuing that successful career was everything. And that motivation was exacerbated by class differences, and the sense that in many ways he was the social inferior of a lot of people around him. And he wanted to live up to whatever the prevailing values and sense of what was respectable in that society. Because of his situation, he was a extraordinary conformist. And if the entire world, in his world, in Germany and the Third Reich, if the whole project was to exterminate Jews, his conscience wasn't going to reject that, because his conscience was entirely tied up in approval from superiors and respectability and all that stuff. His whole devotion to Hitler, by the way, was made worse by the fact that Hitler was also a bumpkin, essentially, who became powerful, and Eichmann identified with him.
He loved it. He was the Lance Corporal who became the Fuhrer.
Yeah, exactly. So that class thing, I think, is interesting, especially in light of our episode on Orwell, where Orwell emphasizes the fact that totalitarianism is sort of the cancerous growth of this sort of idea of status and respectability. If you remember, he claims that the source of totalitarianism will be middle class, upper middle class, and upper middle class bureaucrats who are essentially meritocrats and careerists. Totalitarianism is just the logical final result of that hierarchy. Not the necessarily logical result, but the worst possible case of the growth of that hierarchy into something terrible.
Let's say a dialectical variation, just to give it a fancy name, not the logical result.
I was just thinking that part of that horribleness is, even though Hitler is behind it, and in the case of Eichmann, his own sense of duty, as we talked about earlier, is tied up with how he understands what the real law of the land is. It's also the case that there is this bureaucratic mechanism is a kind of faceless state of an entity of nobody. And Arendt gestures to this at the end of the book. And I wanted to hear her talk more about it, but that part of what's going on and what the discussion that would be profitable off of her book would be the dangers of that government of nobody in a bureaucracy in which someone like Eichmann basically says he isn't responsible. Because in some sense, nobody's responsible, because there isn't anybody who is identified as running something. There's an aspect of it that there is a machine that's just moving along, and people are doing what the activities of just making the machine run.
Yeah.
Right.
There are exceptions. The chapter 7 on the Wannsee Conference, which just as an aside, this whole first 8 chapters that we referred to my understanding of the mechanics and how the Holocaust happened in sort of step-by-step manner, I didn't know any deep details on it. And these 8 chapters for me were the most intricate, detailed history of how the practical logistics of it, not in the sense of just necessarily transporting people and stuff like that, but the mechanism that made that happen. And in particular, the Wannsee Conference, where you have this group of high-ranking National Socialists and then also in the German government separately, get together and work out the logistics of the final solution. Like, who's going to make sure the trains run on time? Who's going to arrange for the soldiers to get fed? I mean, all those things, which just imagining that room and that conversation after which they have drinks, that was probably the most horrifying part of the whole book for me.
So the philosophical characterization of what Dylan just mentioned, this idea that there's an agentless state, I guess you could say. And there's a lot that's to the mechanics of that. The first is that the Nazis invented a language for describing this, the final solution, which took the sting out of the actual saying the words like gassing or killing or organized emigration and whatever. And they had a whole nomenclature of the way they spoke about it in very neutral terms, right? So to begin with, the original characterization way back when, even before Hitler came to power, was the Jewish question, right? Which already makes ambiguous what it is that's being described. But so there's a way that they spoke about it so that people would not, they would take the sting out of the conscience as they were working through the mechanics. And then there was the fact that the intent that came directly from Hitler was often, Hitler's instructions were verbal. So there's this complicated system where Hitler speaks and then his agents and ministers and whatever actually enact legislation or rules or whatever about how things are going to be done. So there's this way in which it all points back to Hitler, but there was no written record, so to speak, of his accountability. But the way that Arendt characterizes what you're describing is, I don't remember whether Eichmann uses the term idealist or if she introduces it, but she talks about an idealist as being somebody who's willing to sacrifice people for an idea. It's the way that she characterizes Eichmann.
It's the way he thinks of his relationships with the Jewish
Zionist
representatives, the Zionists that he's dealing with. He thinks of them, hey, these guys they're idealists just like me. They're prepared to sacrifice everything and everybody to this idea, to this ideal. That's chapter 3.
Yeah, it's on page 41, and it's Eichmann who talks of himself as an idealist, though Arendt puts the word idealist in quotes all the time.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So it's this idea that he has fidelity to the idea of solving the Jewish question, because that's critical to the future of Europe and the Reich, as far as he's told. And so everything subordinates itself to the accomplishment of that particular task or the realization of that idea. And I think part of what Arendt's question in the book is, do you remember when we read, was it Simone de Beauvoir that talked about
the serious men?
The serious men, right? The question, I think, in some sense, can be formulated as Arendt saying, how is it possible? We think of people who are willing to sacrifice, you think of Hitler as being the one who could sacrifice others for an idea. But how is it that millions and millions of people were persuaded to that way of thinking and started essentially through ignorance, and I don't mean ignorance like through avoidance, became complicit in sacrificing people to an idea instead of just being able to weigh on the other side the actual grounded reality of the human beings that they knew. As she says in the book, everybody had their good Jew, right? Everybody says, yeah, we have to solve the Jewish question, but my neighbor, fought in World War I. He's one of the good ones, right? And so the part of the question is, how is that relationship, that actual concrete human relationship, outweighed by subordination to this abstract idea that permits you to just essentially wipe away your conscience?
So I think abstraction is the key. The willingness to think in generalities. So this sort of relates to Arendt's theory of judgment, which we've gotten a little bit of at various places. She sort of hints at it a little bit at the end of this book, but doesn't discuss it with a lot of explicitness. But the idea is that there's a kind of judgment that doesn't simply subsume particulars under a universal, that pays attention to the particular. And in the case of thinking about human beings, does this by allowing us to imaginatively occupy other people's perspectives, which she called going visiting. And by the way, she relies on a lot of Kant for a lot of this, and she's thinking about his reflective judgment in particular, which we associate with aesthetic judgment, but she's broadening that. So this idea of being able to think from the standpoint of someone else by the exercise of imagination, which is not just to say empathize with them, but really think about the possible judgments of others in any given situation. Instead of subsuming particulars under some universal category, thinking of all the different perspectives one might have on that. And that's what she accuses Eichmann of not being able to do, right? He has a defect in thinking, and his defect in thinking is a defect in thinking from the standpoint of other people. And she says it's reflected in his language and in the sort of language rule set that you mentioned and the cliches he uses. Basically, there are a lot of these mechanisms that impair people's ability to make these judgments, impair people's ability to think. That's the sort of novel, interesting take she has on this. It's not that Eichmann became a bloodthirsty murderer. It's that his ability to think was impaired by several different factors. And we should discuss at some point the whole Eichmann's use of cliches and the way they would put him in this ebullient mood, and because I think that's a really important component of this.
Yeah. I do want to just kind of add one point here that I'm hoping this will connect back. So when you think back now on the Jewish philosophers that we've read, so we've read Maimonides, we read Buber, we've read Levinas, and
Spinoza.
Sorry. It's funny that I don't think of Spinoza as a Jew that way, but dialectically, I think he was. But this notion of the individual and the particular versus the abstract and the general. So Arendt diagnoses this idealism, this sacrificing of the individual to an idea as part of the problem. And if you think back on Levinas, for example, let me connect this to what Wes just said. He's talking about Eichmann having no conscience, right? That there was no evidence of conscience, but part of the question is, was there anybody who was external to Eichmann who said, oh my God, that challenged the conscience, right? Is there any external, either societal or superego or parental or some kind of external conscience that would hold him in check? And part of the argument for the defense is there was no external conscience, right? That because there was nobody in society telling him that he was doing something wrong, he couldn't judge that he was doing something wrong. But if you think and connect this back to the idea of I and thou or Levinas's responsibility in the face of the other, the individual themselves carries with them the weight of conscience. So just your interaction with another individual should be sufficient to generate the sense of responsibility or external conscience that's required for you to recognize their humanity, if you will, or recognize their dignity or what have you. And so, with the exception maybe of Spinoza, all the Jewish thinkers and in the Jewish intellectual tradition is skeptical of the abstract. It's skeptical of generalization precisely because it contains within it the seeds of, for lack of a better word, politically totalitarianism and morally, right, cruelty and that sort of thing. So I'm hoping that through this reading, you guys are getting that connection, and this has kind of been a thread that weaves back through, and it informs my kind of view of the world, why I'm less interested in ontology and metaphysics and more interested in this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and Eichmann's cliches are a preeminent example of generalization, of the inability to think in concrete terms, and what she calls stock phrases, which defended Eichmann against reality and the consciousness of his self-deception. So a lot of this has to do with his view of Jews as sort of his respectable enemies. They're on the same level as him, and it's just, we were enemies, we respected each other, we went to battle, I lost, touche, please forgive me and let's move on, something like that. And even the way he prided himself on his relationships with certain Jewish representatives, for instance, the guy he went to visit in the concentration camp, Dr. Storfer is his name. Storfer tried to run and he ended up in a concentration camp and appealed to Eichmann for help. And Eichmann went and said things like, well, we had this normal human encounter, and said to Storfer, we certainly got it. What rotten luck. And then he said, it was a great inner joy to me that I could at least see the man with whom I had worked for so many long years and that we could speak to each other. These are the sort of stock phrases that Eichmann is prone to, including the story that he is sort of this unfortunate guy, and that if he just unloads this tale of misfortune to his Israeli captors, they're actually going to sympathize with him. It's these sorts of examples where Arendt really goes concretely into his way of thinking that's very telling. So this idea that he was pulling together with the Jews, for instance, that they were sort of his comrades during the assisted emigration part of things, just this inability to think of it from their perspective, where I'm afraid I need to get out of here, and not, hey, I'm going to Eichmann, my buddy, so we can accomplish this project together, and isn't it going to be great? Which is Eichmann's absurd way of understanding it.
So yeah, I'm wondering about the connection between the stock phrases things as sort of not thinking at all and having a different narrative. Certainly the stock phrases serve this narrative of picturing himself as this hard luck case, just trying to get on in his environment. And page 105 to 106, the final solution chapter, she goes into some of the things that Himmler would say in his speeches to justify, to tell the story of where they were, what they were doing, to have stuck it out and apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent. That is what has made us hard. This is a page in the glory of our history, which has never been written and which is never to be written. Or, in order to solve the Jewish question, this was the most frightening order an organization could ever receive. Or, we realize that what we are expecting from you is to be superhumanly inhuman. She goes on a little lower. It is noteworthy that Himmler hardly ever attempted to justify in ideological terms, and if he did, it was apparently quickly forgotten. What stuck in the minds of these men who had become murderers was simply the notion of being involved in something historic, grandiose, unique, a great task that occurs once in 2,000 years, which must therefore be difficult to bear. This was important because the murderers were not sadists or killers by nature. On the contrary, a systematic effort was made to weed out all those who derive physical pleasure from what they did. Hence the problem was how to overcome not so much their conscience as the animal pity by which all normal men are affected in the presence of physical suffering. The trick used by Himmler, who apparently was rather strongly afflicted with these instinctive reactions himself, was very simple and probably very effective. It consisted in turning these instincts around, as it were, in directing them towards the self. So instead of saying, what horrible things I did to people, the murderers would be able to say, what horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties and how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders.
Yep. It's a really good example of the failure of judgment here and the way it can be deformed or impaired, or I don't know what a good word for it is, but through this reversal of pity.
Well, and it's also not normalizing the activity of the killing, but actually acknowledging that it's not normal, but then appealing to a supernormal time, that you're being asked to do something that you're right. Your inner instincts are that this is terrible and this is wrong. And the way you're going to get around it is hold on to something like your duty or whatever that, tough things have to be done in order to get to the other side kind of thing.
Yeah. So a couple things about this. The first thing is that what underwrites this is this kind of religious fervor that was associated with, this wasn't simply nationalism in the sense of do this for Germany, right? The Third Reich was to be the 1,000-year Reich. So all of this had to be done to establish the 1,000-year Reich, which was a religious mission almost. It's not as simple as appealing to some extra normal commitment to what we might consider to be a normal instinct, like fidelity to family or community, right? Because it wasn't even fidelity to Germany as a nation. It was fidelity to the Führer, who is really a channeling the establishment of this 1,000-year Reich. Here's the process. You're going to acknowledge that the act is morally bankrupt or corrupt or evil or wrong, but you claim that it needs to be done in the service of something else. And then you come up with a language and a process that systematizes the prosecution of those actions that allows you to divorce yourself from agency. And so when you think about at each stage of that process, how it would be possible to get there, if you think of yourself as an individual, how could I stand by or even participate in doing something that I know was wrong? Well, the first is you'd have to have the conviction that doing it was for some kind of a greater good. And in this case, it's not simply because Germany needs it to defend its borders. It's because you're doing something that is unprecedented and, will have massive historical ramifications. And then it can't be that it's left to your direct agency where you're constantly having to make judgments and be faced with the reality of what you're doing. It has to be systematized in such a way that you can participate and essentially divorce yourself as an agent from the actual actions.
That's one of the ways in which conscience is defeated. She actually gives a lot of different examples of the way one might defeat conscience. The grandiosity, Himmler's method is one of them. And that's in chapter 6. In chapter 7, we see her say, it's not that Eichmann didn't have a conscience. It's that his conscience was basically the voice of society around him. So the way she puts it, Eichmann, in contrast to other elements in Nazi society, had always been overawed by good society, and the politeness he often showed to German-speaking Jewish functionaries was to a large extent the result of his recognition that he was dealing with people who were socially his superiors. What he fervently believed, and up to the end, was success, the chief standard of good society as he knew it. He did not need to close his ears to the voice of conscience, as the Judgement has it, not because he had none, but because his conscience spoke with a respectable voice, with the voice of respectable society around him. And she says one of the most potent factors in soothing his conscience was basically he couldn't see anyone around him who was against the final solution. And this is the chapter, by the way, in which she goes extensively into the compliance of Jewish leaders with the Nazis and sort of rounding up Jews and giving them, lists of people, and there were even Jewish commandos to round people up. And she implies that basically that's one of the things that actually assuaged his conscience. It wasn't just the Nazis who thought this was normal. It was Germans in general, and it was even the victims who, in some sense, whose lack of resistance made it seem normal. By the way, she's not judging them for the lack of resistance. This is one of the things that got her in trouble. She doesn't think any group of people would have acted any differently or could have under the circumstances, but she does take note of it.
And tells about some rebels in some Dutch Jews that actually did kill some Nazis, and they were tortured horribly, such that she says they would envy the folks in Auschwitz, and that this kind of reprisal is something that the Nazis used, wanted ready in people's minds.
But she does have some harsh words for the Jewish leadership in Germany, and even in the postscript thinks that is a open question, and it's a very, very divisive. She acknowledges it's an incredibly divisive question.
She says that, like Eichmann, they enjoyed their status and power. They enjoyed the fact that it put them in a leadership role.
Yeah, for both the Jewish leaders and just the leaders of the countries that were being invaded and annexed. In going through how things worked in the different countries, I think Sweden is one that just didn't cooperate, would promise things and would not deliver them. Was that
Denmark? It's not Sweden. Denmark is the famous example where they just said no.
Okay.
They said no and no one got killed. And to some extent, Italy, more complicated example, but Italians, even under Mussolini, didn't comply.
I think she says eventually they did comply.
And also Bulgaria is another standout example. Don't want to leave the Bulgarians out. Bulgarians totally resisted.
A lot of moving parts in making something like this happen. Unless there's cooperation from a lot of people, then you do not get this kind of horror going on.
And she said, and it wasn't even like they didn't even suffer any reprisals for it. Like the Germans on the ground didn't have the heart to continue if there was any resistance. So when they met resistance in Bulgaria and Denmark, they basically just gave up.
Yeah. this goes back to what I was saying about having to institute the system where you can divorce yourself from agency, right? Cooperation makes it possible. Lack of friction in the process through cooperation, through participation. So faced with resistance, right, the individual agent who was responsible wasn't able to overcome their conscience, right? In other words, that fidelity to the idea, that first phase of overcoming where you have to have fidelity to the idea is not strong enough to overcome the individual moral conscience when it comes to if you actually have to lift a finger, so to speak, or persuade somebody or overcome resistance. And I think, again, this is part of Arendt's point. She's saying it's really about almost like momentum. It was inertia combined with belief that brought about this. It was not that there were moral monsters or there was mass hypnosis or something like that. It's the fact that this all was made possible simply by the fact that people didn't say no. And they didn't say no for a variety of complicated reasons. But she feels strongly, I think, that we need to understand this because she says it in the, I don't remember if it's the latter half of the book or the postscript, or that anytime something's unprecedented, right, you don't understand it, you don't know how to deal with it. So in the case of genocide was unprecedented. There had been mass exterminations of ethnic groups and things like that previously, but it all took place within the borders of sovereign state. And what differentiated this was the attempt to wipe one individual group off the face of the earth, regardless of national borders.
Also for no utilitarian purpose.
Well, obviously they thought they had a purpose, but it was not an immediate for the war, not to winning the war.
Not connected to a military aim or
colonialism,
right.
Or to, what the specific purpose is only to wipe that group out because they are bad. It's not a byproduct of some larger goal. She calls them administrative massacres, she thinks is a superior term to genocide.
And even though there was a lot of taking of money and property and stuff like that involved, it wasn't for the sake of that this annihilation was going on, right? That there was just sort of an efficiency of making sure that, you didn't leave anything on the table as part of that.
Right. The point of me bringing this up was that she says, okay, this was unprecedented, and here's the ways in which it was unprecedented. It's different than what has come before. Now, the temptation is to say, because it's unprecedented, because it's exceptional, there was something exceptional in the cause, and it can't happen again. And what she says is, no, unprecedented means that now it is precedented, and that we should not only worry, but we should expect the same thing to happen again. And so the question becomes, we must understand how it was possible that this happened. And what she comes up with in this analysis is understanding that the narrative where we have monsters, evil, and unique circumstances that give birth to the situation where something like this can happen, if we read exceptionalism into it, we will miss the opportunity to understand and be able to safeguard against the recurrence of this in the future.
So ultimately, it's about, again, a failure of judgment, right? And it's a compromised faculty of judgment in the face of the sort of insane belief that has taken over the rest of society.
Sorry, Wes, I want to ask, is it a compromise of the faculty of judgment or is it a compromise of conviction?
Her whole theme here is judgment. So the way she puts it in the postscript, for instance, is those few who were still able to tell right from wrong went really only by their own judgments. And they did so freely. There were no rules to be abided by under which the particular cases with which they were confronted could be subsumed. That's typical Kantian faculty of judgment, subsume the particulars under the universals. They had to decide in each instance as it arose because no rules existed for the unprecedented. That's reflective judgment where you simply pay attention to the particular and draw conclusions from the particular. The idea is that most of the time, the way our judgment works is we are just subsumers. We have a set of pre-established rules in our mind and we subsume the particulars under them and we operate machine-like that in some sense, which is to say unthinkingly, not stupidly. She distinguishes being stupid. Eichmann is not stupid, but he's unthinking in that sense. And to really think and this is a very Heideggerian point as well, by the way, to really think and not just be an automaton, once again, means that one is capable of a certain type of judgment, which pays attention in particular, and specifically in this case, can look at things from the standpoint of someone else, to come back to that basic assessment of Eichmann that she makes, which is that he was unable to think, which is, I think, related to this inability to judge, specifically from the standpoint of someone else. So I wanted to bring all those things together. The way in which we're affected by society and what's become normal within the society, the way that filters down into our everyday, the way we judge things, and the way we resist that, which is to engage, I think, for Arendt in real thinking and a kind of judgment which can rebel against simple rule following.
Having a prescription, I don't know that I noticed this so specifically, but I guess in the discussion of Kant, she says part of Kant's morality is that you become a legislator for morality yourself. You are making your own decisions. You are thinking. So in that place, at least, she explicitly, at least strongly implies that if you're going to be moral, then you have to think individually. And certainly in all this discussion of cliches, she's talking about not thinking authentically, but there's no, in this text at least, explicit, like in Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity or something, prescription. I don't think it would work, is what I'm working toward here, to have a mass prescription that everybody must think individually, or else we're likely to fall into this trouble. There needs to be something about the culture itself. There need to be things that are built in to keep this sort of madness from getting a hold. But it seems like that would not have to be so radical as everybody must be a philosopher of some sort.
I don't think it's everyone must be a philosopher. And yes, I'm drawing on background knowledge of Arendt here. Yes, this focus on people's ability to truly think and make real judgments is important. The references in the text are indirect. I think you're right. But it is telling that those few who were able to tell right from wrong went really only by their own judgments, and they did so freely. There were no rules to be abided by. At some point, if you're living in a Nazi regime and everyone else is running around contributing to mass murder as if it's just, hey, this is everyday normal experience, you will be pulled by that. You will be, I think naturally any of us there'll be a gravitational pull towards the idea that, okay, these are the norms and my conscience is a function of what other people and what society in general thinks is respectable and right and good. And the only way one might resist that is if one's conscience unmoors itself from the idea of what's respectable to other people. If judgments become free and independent of that societal rule following and internalization of what everyone else says is good and right.
Which is just interesting to think about whether that is really possible, right? If you're thinking about Adam Smith's impartial spectator, the way that Russ Roberts described it was, this is the way that people's conscience works, is that they imagine other people, their peers, and how they would judge things. And there is stuff in there as you abstract. Well, what if my actual peers are wrong? Well, you kind of imagine better and better peers. But where are you getting that notion of better and better? It still has to be something that is culturally available to you. So I do think that the way that Arendt tells the story here is that there's plenty of disparate background moral thinking that people could draw on, no matter what society you're in, but certainly in a society and well-educated people like some of these people she's talking about who were actively involved in the atrocities. So you're right, there's a magnetism, but it's not a complete blockade. It's not the sort of society that we read about in 1984, where there's just no cognitive matter available to you to think contrary to the mass.
And in fact, there's great violence in the case of 1984 to make sure that you stay in line. If you're not doing that, then there is a process of rehabilitating or exterminating you.
She did think of the Nazi regime as totalitarian and not simply fascist. So Arendt was very careful about making distinctions between mere authoritarian regimes and mere fascist regimes and truly totalitarian regimes. And she thought of the Third Reich as truly totalitarian in the sense of trying to formulate total control over the mind of every individual and succeeding to a great degree.
So maybe it's worth reading her book on totalitarianism at some point. I guess I was thinking about this idea that you get pulled along by your culture. And while that seems certainly true, it does seem like there would be enough context in the broad range of human experience to know that rounding up people and killing them is outside the lines, right? That would not have been unheard of as being a bad idea.
That's great.
Right. It's quite different than like the treatment of slaves or something like that.
So here's what I would say to this. Dylan, you're right. And part of the challenge with this is you get a hint of it in Eichmann in Jerusalem, but the situation was so complex in terms of this didn't happen overnight, right? It was a decade-long process or longer that started back in, the early 1930s. And to get to the point where this was accepted by people, where they actively participated in it without the kind of resistance you're talking about, it was a process that required a lot of activity.
They boiled the frog, basically.
They boiled the frog. And I have some recommended reading. At the end of the episode, remind me, and I'll give some recommendations to the listeners about where they can learn more about how this process took place.
I think actually this book gave to me a pretty good idea of it, that the incremental process of pressured/forced emigration to concentration to final solution, a kind of incremental approach to it.
Sorry, just to clarify, there's that aspect of it, but then there's also the aspect of how Germany became essentially a one-party system and how the Nazis took control with the elimination of social democrats and communists, and understanding like how the voice of the other in German society was eliminated by the Nazis over time, and how people were essentially convinced or forced to become part of the machine. That's another aspect of the story that needs to be told.
Well, that's sort of the aspect of the totalitarianism, and both how totalitarianism is executed and also the end effect of it. We've been talking about Eichmann's conscience and the way in which he was able to separate himself from the deeds. There was a time where he goes to the concentration camp and he testifies that he finds it so overwhelming to see all these horrible things happening, and he just feels like he can't do it. But he's able to separate himself in the sense of, I'm doing my duty and not pulling the trigger on anything. It did make me think about, there were people pulling triggers, right? And there were people driving these mobile gas vans and loading up people into the vans and then driving around. Somebody turned a lever to open up gas. They all died, and then they dump them in a ditch. And there are people who are doing that.
Many themselves Jews, as she points out, like because they were forced to, you'll be spared if you participate.
Maybe that's part of the answer, I guess. It's kind of a recognition that it's only by essentially holding a gun to somebody's head that you're going to get them to do those things.
Eichmann's reaction, though, is kind of telling, right? So this gas vans thing is at Culm, and he witnesses people being put into the vans and shrieking, and then the corpses being thrown out into the ditch. And then he talks about, after that, just being silent and not talking to his driver for hours, like not being able to talk. And then he says, so his account of it is, there I got enough. I was finished. I only remember that a physician in white overalls told me to look through a hole into the truck while they were still in it. I refused to do that. I could not. I had to disappear. And the way he tells the other stories where he's seeing people being shot. And by the way, he has a few grazes with the monstrous stuff. According to Arendt, when he visited Auschwitz, for instance, he probably didn't see anything. And at Culm, he saw these gas fans, and at Lublin, he saw some preparations. And then at Minsk, he sees people shot. And then at another place, he sees this there's a blood story about a fountain of blood. But he always talks about this in terms of feeling weak, and he talks about it in terms of how it affects him and how terrible it was for him to have to see these things. Not in terms of the standpoint of the victims or any moral language, just, I felt sick to my stomach, my knees were weak, this was too much for me. Why did I have to see this? And it's really fascinating.
There's an interesting part of that quote. I cannot tell how many Jews entered. I hardly looked. I could not. I had had enough. The shrieking, and I was much too upset, and so on. As I later told Mueller when I reported to him, he did not get much profit out of my report.
He was prevented from doing a good job.
Yes, exactly. I was so disturbed I could not do a good job.
So one thing Arendt does say, just speaking to our question about where conscience goes, the way she ends chapter 8, before she gets into all the deportation stuff, And just as the law in civilized countries assumes that the voice of conscience tells everybody, thou shalt not kill, even though man's natural desires and inclinations may at times be murderous, so the law of Hitler's land demanded that the voice of conscience tell everybody, thou shalt kill, although the organizers of the massacres knew full well that murder is against the normal desires and inclinations of most people. Evil in the Third Reich had lost the quality by which most people recognize it, the quality of temptation. Many Germans and many Nazis, probably an overwhelming majority of them, must have been tempted not to murder, not to rob, not to let their neighbors go off to their doom, and not to become accomplices in all these crimes by benefiting from them. But God knows they had learned how to resist temptation. So what's really fascinating here,
great quote,
yeah, is the quality of almost moralistic quality. It's like, from our perspective, this is evil. And this gets at the whole banality thing. But from their perspective, it would have been evil not to follow this newly developed voice of conscience, which says you should kill or you should witness the gruesome things that Eichmann witnessed, even though you don't want to. You're doing your duty. You're fulfilling your obligation. And the fact that you're repelled by and don't want to do it, well, that's basically the way we are with our obligations. We don't want to do them. We have to do them. What's so terrifying about it all is it's not that one becomes a monster and says to oneself, yes, I'm now going to do evil things. It's that the voice of what tells you to do these things seems to be the voice of conscience, seems to be the voice of what is good and moral.
Using the language of doing something that's difficult or unpalatable in that kind of bureaucratic way, that language just makes it sound like it's the equivalent of having a riff at your office and you're a manager and you have to go and fire 5 people on your team because your boss told you that you need to cut your budget by $700,000. And you feel terrible about it because you're having to make choices about who goes, and you know that they're not going to have jobs after this, and you feel terrible about it. That's the way in which the activity is being normalized, right? Is equating all those kinds of ways of doing things that are difficult with all other kinds of things of doing things that are difficult. Ways that we would normally respond to our conscience, even with like raising children, right? You know, you deprive your children of something they really, really want to do because you know it's better for them than not, but you still feel bad about making them feel pain because they didn't get to go to the event with their friends.
So in trying to modernize the lesson here, I'm trying to figure out how much it matters that we understand the motivations of the original, the thing that led to the slippery slope here. So this slippery slope idea, we talked about a little about how it was a step-by-step process by which the Jews were treated worse and worse, and that Germany became totalitarianism. And Arendt is actually critical of the slippery slope thinking in that she characterizes Israel's treatment of genocide as just the biggest, worst, most terrible pogrom in Jewish history, but that this is not something fundamentally new. This is the oldest kind of slight that we remember. That's kind of part of what our historical understanding of ourselves is based on.
There's a Jewish joke that all of our holidays follow the same script. They tried to kill us. We survived. Now let's eat.
So in trying to think about how, could it happen here? It's interesting to think about what the connections between it, like the rhetoric, or how close does the rhetoric have to be in terms of even just talking about the Jewish question in the first place as a problem. And I recall as recently as the 1960s, or maybe even the 80s, they still talking about as like the Negro problem, which might even be a way of characterizing like, okay, there are these people that have been historically wronged that are in our midst. How do we make nice with them? It might not have necessarily, putting it that way, the implication of how do we ship all the Negroes back to Liberia or whatever the stupid solution that would be comparable to what some of the Germans were thinking at this time. But, just the fact that you can't use that term anymore. You can't call race relations problem the Negro problem, like not only because we don't want to use the word Negro, but just because it's not their problem. But yet now we have the problem of illegal immigration and how easily that becomes it's a problem that we have all these people here that, some percentage of the populace, including our current leadership, doesn't want to be here. And so how scared should we be about just the existence of that rhetoric? How slippery is the slope, I guess? And do we have to understand why these ordinary Germans would feel that the Jews were such a problem that getting rid of them would, even though it's horrible and I hate to do it and I realize that there are people but geez, it really just has to be done. And, we're part of some great long-term thing. If we can just solve this problem and if we had only headed this off in the first place, then we wouldn't have this problem now, right? The modern thing would be, if only we'd have better enforcement, we wouldn't have all these illegals here now. But the fact that we have all these illegals here now, there are no good solutions. Something, we're going to be tearing people away from their families or whatever to solve this problem, but it has to be done.
That's where the element of race and racial purity and blood, and there's a lot tied up in the mythology of National Socialism that people think of as, this goes back to this idea about perpetrating the crime for the pursuance of a political aim, for example. And, okay, well, these people are living in land that we want to take, so we need to move them or exterminate them. That's a motivation that's externally understandable. And politically, or I guess you could say, according to the framework of the Geneva Convention or whatever makes sense. But the Nazi ideology of the Eternal Reich, right, the 1,000-year Reich, required a notion of racial purity and other elements that made exterminating the Jews a critical part of their plan. And so Arendt points out a number of times that even when the war was winding down and they were desperately short on supplies, they never said, we need to redirect these resources to do something else. It was a critical part of their, or at least of Hitler's overall plan, that this happen. And she makes the point that initially the euthanasia strategy was to be employed upon the mentally ill, socially unfit, not necessarily Jews and gypsies, but on members of society who would be drains on the resources of society and not genetically appropriate for furthering the race. And so, there's so many complex elements to this that add up that are required to explain why the Jews, why then, all that sort of thing. But I think your general point that the motivation is irrelevant. All right, we can look at the structure and try to understand why it was the Jews this time and why Germany and so forth. But Arendt's point is you don't need to understand what motivates them. What you need to understand is the mechanics of human psychology and social transformation and political will that bring about the conditions that make it possible for this to happen. And then turn that around and looking at the individual Eichmann and going to a broader statement about society. Once you understand those dynamics, to turn back around and bring that back down to your own individual judgment, as Wes pointed out, and be able to intervene and recognize when or if you are yourself participating.
And she thinks the reaction to her book is actually an indication of how averse people are to making judgments and to confronting what she calls the question of judgment. So this is at the end of the postscript. She thinks what ultimately people are upset by is her being a stickler on the question of judgment in the sense of judging Eichmann as an individual, as opposed to generalizing it and making it about evil or the Holocaust as a whole or anything like that. In the beginning, she wants to keep laser focused on Eichmann himself. She thinks the trial ought to focus on his deeds and him as an individual rather than, say, the suffering of the Jews. And we relate this whole question of the judgment that's being directed at Eichmann is not unrelated to what I've called the defect in judgment of the people living under the Nazi regime who don't resist or who lose their conscience.
And part of that was her insistence on focusing on his specific deeds and his specific person, as opposed to talking about either the fate of the Jews in general or Germany in general, or abstracting it historically, making it very, very big. So in the book, she's hewing very, very close to specific facts and specific people. She's going through names, who reported to whom, what was the organization of things in that report way.
Yeah, I think we ought to distinguish what she thinks the trial should do, which is to hew closely to the individual doer. And then what her book does, which in a sense she does that, but also her book can be, because the trial was about more than Eichmann, the book is about more than Eichmann as well. And thankfully so. And she is examining these deeper questions about Eichmanns motivations and about how this could happen and all that stuff, and what happened in the Holocaust in general. All that stuff that I think she thinks the trial should not have been in its pursuit of justice.
She also wanted to make sure that in talking about his specific activities, that he is not responsible for everything, right? She criticizes the trial, particularly the prosecutors, as essentially making him a bigger deal than he was, as being, at some point, they hang the whole idea and organization of the final solution on Eichmann. And she considers that factual error really bad and dangerous, not because it somehow slanders Eichmann, but because it misunderstands deeply what was going on. And so you lose the lesson that you might be able to get out of understanding Eichmann, because that portrayal of him as being sort of the grand master of this also plays into the idea that the way this kind of thing happens is because of some kind of deep sadistic evil on the part of individual people. Both those things have a kind of exceptionalism of their own that undermines for her, I think the lesson, and I think also the true horribleness of it.
Yeah. Can I read a really good quote? Sort of sums all of that up. So this is in the epilogue, and this is it's actually one of the three things she addresses about the trial, is whether it comprehended Eichmann. There are three different objections, and just one of them is that it didn't comprehend Eichmann and that it was important to. So she says, they knew, of course, that it would have been very comforting indeed to believe that Eichmann was a monster, even though if he had been, Israel's case against him would have collapsed or, at the very least, lost all interest. Surely one can hardly call upon the whole world and gather correspondence from the four corners of the earth in order to display Bluebeard in the dock. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together, for it implied, as had been said at Nuremberg over and over again by the defendants and their counsels, that this new type of criminal, who is in actual fact hostis generis humani, commits his crimes under circumstances that make it well nigh impossible for him to know or to feel that he is doing wrong. So ultimately, she's going to argue in the end, in this epilogue, that our common legal notions really aren't suitable, aren't adequate to dealing with a crime of this proportions. So she says, the larger issues at stake in the Eichmann trial was the assumption current in all modern legal systems that intent to do wrong is necessary for the commission of a crime. And that, she's going to say, in this case, we have to put that aside. She advocates this point by Yosel Regad, that a great crime offends nature so that the earth cries out for vengeance, that evil violates a natural harmony which only retribution can restore, that a wrong collectivity owes a duty to the moral order to punish the criminal. And ultimately, in her end speech, so she's giving this hypothetical judgment, the judgment she sort of wishes the judges had given to Eichmann. And she's going to say something to the effect that, well, in a sense, vengeance is cried out for, which is interesting because in the beginning of the book, she rejects the idea that justice is about vengeance, at least the vengeance of the victims. Here, she's embracing a certain kind of vengeance, but it's the vengeance of the collectivity. It's the vengeance that restores the moral order, and that's the important distinction.
The problem here comes because it's international. It's an international issue, so international law, that she thinks that the correct view of justice is not, as you say, revenge. It's that the society has been wronged, so there needs to be reparations to repair the rip in society.
Criminal proceedings, since they are mandatory and thus initiated, even if the victim would prefer to forgive and forget, rest on a law whose essence, to quote Taylor writing in the New York Times Magazine, is that a crime is not committed only against the victim, but primarily against the community whose law is violated.
Yes, just as a murderer is prosecuted because he has violated the law of the community, and not because he has deprived the Smith family of its husband, father, and breadwinner, so these modern state-employed mass murderers must be prosecuted because they violated the order of mankind, and not because they killed millions of people. The whole point in moving from the earth cries out to vengeance to society needs to be put back together is to sort of make it more concrete, more modern, less superstitious. We know how bad a direction once you take a fundamentally superstitious ideology as the thing that motivates your justice, that things can go terribly wrong. But yet, just referring to actual states, I think Arendt is saying, does not do justice to our intuitions about how some crimes can be committed. And in particular, these crimes against a whole people really have to be seen as not just something that offended the Jews, but crimes against humanity itself. How do we make philosophically respectable, non-mystical, the notion that there can be a crime against humanity? We need to philosophically clarify that, so we're not just referring to the balance of nature or something, some superstitious sounding abstraction.
Well, it's particularly true that the crimes against humanity are a way of getting at holding states or state-like entities accountable for their actions. It's short of a super state, right? But it's putting those state activities in the context of, in some kind of context at all, as a way of holding them accountable. Otherwise, you don't have a mechanism for justice, because justice is defined by the activities of the state. In fact, that was part of the attempt at defending Eichmann by his defense attorney, was that because as an act of state, there's no one to judge that, right? States do what states do. And there's no super legal framework in which to hold them accountable for a law that was broken. You have to make laws that can be broken in order to hold them accountable.
Yeah, she said the UN had at that point rejected the establishment of a permanent international criminal court twice. And I had to look up that it was only 2002 that we got The Hague that actually can do that now. And its jurisdiction is pretty limited, such that you can even have Saddam Hussein saying, I don't recognize the legitimacy of this body that is coming forth to judge me. A lot of state leaders are still, I think that's essentially what the idea of America first and rejecting the UN is a matter of saying there really is nothing higher than the individual state's sovereignty. So this is still a live issue, even though we have some international mechanism now that's built out of treaties, as she says, that's how that comes together. It's not like we have come up with something like the social contract. All nations should agree to these abstract ways of mediating between them. No, it's actual votes and actual precedent in terms of things like this. So she points at this trial as not having established what she would prefer to be a precedent in dealing with international issues like this. It's one of her political anti-Israel beefs here.
Yeah, it's a crime against humanity. It's not just a crime against the Jewish people. It's a crime against humanity, and therefore should be tried in an international court. I wanted to backtrack a little bit because I have a different interpretation of the very end of the epilogue, where she says, we refuse and consider as barbaric the proposition that a great crime offends nature, so that the very earth cries out for vengeance, that evil violates a natural harmony which only retribution can restore, and so on. I actually think she is trying to lead us back to that. So when she says we refuse, that's our natural inclination. And then she says, and yet I think it is undeniable that it was precisely on the ground of these long-forgotten propositions that Eichmann was brought to justice to begin with, and that they were, in fact, the supreme justification for the death penalty. It sounds like she might be criticizing the court for basing it on that, but I think that's one thing that she thinks one of the few things that she thinks the court got right. Because what she's wrestling with here is the fact that we have a criminal who didn't know that they were doing something wrong. And that's so critical to our normal legal and moral intuitions. Like, if they don't know they're doing wrong, how can we hold them accountable? And she's searching for a definition of responsibility and accountability that rises above, that is independent of whether one knows one is doing wrong. So when she gives that long imaginary judgment to Eichmann in the end, I think that judgment is in the spirit of the great crime that offends nature. You admitted that you committed a crime against the Jewish people, even though you didn't hate the Jews and you couldn't have done otherwise, and that therefore you don't feel guilty for it. Your role was an accident and almost anybody could have done that in your place. In other words, he had bad moral luck, to return us to, I forget which episode we discussed this in, but bad moral luck being something like, if I'm drunk driving and I don't hit anyone, then if I get caught, then it's a low-level criminal offense. If I hit someone and kill them, then suddenly I'm a notorious criminal. The difference between me, the notorious criminal, and me, the person with a DWI, is just moral luck. And that's sort of the essence of Eichmann's claim, is that he was morally unlucky. And she's saying, no, despite all that, and it's not a matter of collective guilt that he's guilty collectively, but she says, you yourself claim not the actuality, but only the potentiality of equal guilt on the part of all who lived in a state whose main political purpose had become the commission of unheard of crimes. She's referencing the idea that anyone would have done this or could have done this in his place. And no matter through what accidents of exterior or interior circumstances you were pushed onto the road of becoming a criminal, there is an abyss between the actuality of what you did and the potentiality of what others might have done. Moving on down, let us assume for the sake of argument that it was nothing more than misfortune that made you a willing instrument in the organization of mass murder. There still remains the fact that you have carried out and therefore actively supported a policy of mass murder. For politics is not like the nursery. In politics, obedience and support are the same. And just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you. This is the reason and the only reason you must hang. So this is a pretty radical conclusion. She's saying, despite intentions and despite bad moral luck, you nevertheless have to be held accountable, and that the Holocaust in particular forces us to this position, or what she calls administrative massacres force us into this position where you have a lot of people who are in a sense, yes, just obeying orders, or yes, just cogs in the machine. And no, Eichmann wouldn't have ended up a murderer if it weren't for the rise of Hitler and the Third Reich. He would have just been a traveling salesman all his life. That doesn't matter. If you did it, then the reparation of the community demands your punishment. You guys may disagree. I wanted to get out my thought on the ending because I thought it was quite radical.
Well, it's rhetorically great. I mean, this is the way the epilogue ends. This is the reason and the only reason you must hang. And it's, you want to cheer along with her that like, you really burned him. But, what do you think of that? That ultimately it's the only reason you must hang. No one can be expected to want to share the earth with you because, you played God yourself. You decided who lives and who dies. You and your people. So she's kind of repersonalizing that it is not quite revenge based, because revenge even might refer to some sort of balance, but it is personal, that ultimately it is a matter of what people want. Maybe there's constraints on that. So it's not that we can want any old thing, but what we can reasonably expect people to want. We don't want to share the earth with you anymore. Therefore, that is sufficient grounds for capital punishment. Like, I thought the whole point in getting outside, this doesn't meet Nussbaum's criterion, that she points out in the ancient Greek play that she refers to. Which one is that?
The Eumenides in particular.
Exactly. That we have to make the jump from justice being a matter of personal revenge to being something that is externalized. And this is the way that, so I would like to keep it depersonalized. I don't think this bit of rhetoric helps her overall argument for that we should have an international court and this should be made more into a rule of law that responds to genocide than individual states taking it upon themselves to engage in revenge. I'm getting a mixed message here is what I'm saying.
But just to clarify my position, because I think it is a weird ending and it is hard to say exactly what she's saying. But what I took this to say is that despite the fact that she rejects vengeance at the beginning of the book, vengeance for the sake of specific victims, she's saying that there can be this more abstract concept of the earth crying out for vengeance, which I think actually she doesn't end up rejecting that idea. Even though she says we do tend to reject it as barbaric, it actually, strangely enough, has a place in figuring out some sense of justice which can be applicable to someone who is a cog in a larger bureaucratic machine, who didn't know they were doing something wrong, who was following orders and all that stuff. We need something. Maybe vengeance is the wrong word for that. Ultimately, I think I like your talk of moving to something, well, it's personal in some sense, but it's sort of maybe some sort of elaboration of the idea of vengeance, or maybe it does get us away from the idea of vengeance. But I still think she's grappling with something that does go beyond our usual intuitions about justice, because she says herself, those intuitions are simply inadequate for dealing with this sort of crime.
I thought that final point that you read, Wes, and it would be worth reading the whole thing, but was her saying, if the judges had been honest about what the whole trial was about, this is what they would have said. And essentially that the real motivation for the trial was vengeance, was exculpation, which was to alleviate some conscience and to have a sense of vengeance. Like, I think that's what she was trying to say, was that if they were honest, that's what they would have said, as opposed to her saying that the motivation for prosecuting against this type of a crime should be that type of motivation. Because she spent some time leading up to that talking about how this new crime of a crime against humanity is legally novel. And it was confusing from a legal perspective about how it should be treated. And who, this goes to who has the right to judge these people and where should that judgment take place, in what jurisdiction. She's connecting it to that, as well as to the notion that if there's this notion of motivation, can you judge the motivation of an individual as part of their guilt or innocence in a circumstance where there is no guilty conscience? There can be no guilty conscience.
Just before that final ending, I think it muddies the water a little bit on exactly what she thinks is correct. Because I think you're right, Seth, to say that she's formulating what the judges should have said if they were essentially honest. Just before those final paragraphs, she says, I think it is undeniable that is precisely on the ground of these long-forgotten propositions, that is, that the earth can cry out for vengeance. These long-forgotten propositions that Eichmann was brought to justice to begin with, and that they were, in fact, the supreme justification for the death penalty. Because he had been implicated and had played a central role in an enterprise whose open purpose was to eliminate forever certain races from the surface of the earth, he had to be eliminated. And if it is true that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done, then the justice of what was done in Jerusalem would have emerged to be seen by all if the judges had dared to address their defendant in something like the following terms. And then comes what she wishes they had said, or what she says they should have said if they were more honest.
So the question is whether she agrees with the more honest assessment, whether that's like the kernel of justice in what they did, despite all the things she criticizes, or if she's also criticizing this and rejecting it.
I thought this was her preferred. Like, I wish they had said this.
Exactly. I think she's saying, look, there is an integrity to what the trial did. There is a real sense of justice. Here's what it is. And if the judges had been honest about that, they covered it up and all the other stuff. If they had been honest about it, here's what they would have said, and she's endorsing that. But I understand the other reading of that. It's puzzling. It's unclear.
There is a section where she talks about people who are critical of the kidnapping and the bringing him to trial in Jerusalem, that they ironically said that the Mossad agents should have just killed him on the streets in Buenos Aires, and that would have been better. And she doesn't agree with that. So that I think it's somewhat support for your reading, Mark and Wes, your reading. Although my initial reading of it was that she was just saying, if we're honest with what we were trying to accomplish, this is what we would have said, without necessarily saying that that was okay, because I think she feels like the whole trial itself was complicated. And this book is partially philosophical, but also in large part a discussion about the legalities and, establishing precedent and doing things for the right reasons juridically, so that we're prepared to deal with this in the future. And at the time, it was very much a live issue in the sense of, this was 1960-something that the book was published. The war was still very real and alive. There were still many, many perpetrators who were being pursued. There was still the entire nation, most of Germany had been alive during the war, and where Germany itself was reconciling itself to its own past. So there's a lot tied up in this. And of course, the establishment of the State of Israel on the back of the Second World War, and the essentially justification that it was only because of the Holocaust that the State of Israel actually came into being. And so there was the fact that this was almost like a referendum or a defiant articulation of Israel's right to exist. There's just so much stuff going on.
Seth, I hope you're right that this is not necessarily something she's endorsing just because of this part with Sodom and Gomorrah. What you meant to say is that we're all or almost all are guilty. Nobody is. This is an indeed quite common conclusion, but one we are not willing to grant you. And if you don't understand our objection, we would recommend to your attention the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, two neighboring cities in the Bible which were destroyed by fire from heaven because all the people in them had become equally guilty.
She rejects collective guilt, though. So it sounds like she's endorsing collective guilt, but she's not. She's just saying the fact that it was an accident for him that he was taking part in this doesn't mean that he's not responsible.
I wouldn't want to bring in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah as an unproblematic, even apart from its possible misinterpretation as collective guilt.
So in other words, if I live in a city where everyone has gone nuts and has succumbed to vice, and I become vice-ridden because of that, I'm not excused for my vice-riddenness. That's really the point of all that. The cultural, appealing, and she says this directly in other parts of this, appealing to the deterministic social and psychological causes of my venality, of my viciousness, is not an excuse, does not get me off the hook.
In my mind, part of the net takeaway is that if the world goes crazy around you, you still have an obligation to exercise your judgment against that. Exercise judgment for the purpose of moral rectitude. And I'm trying to remember, is it not the case that for the sake of one righteous person, that the cities would be saved?
That's part of the story?
Yeah, I can't remember if that's the story or if it's a different one.
Let's just say it is. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So the Lord informs, Abraham that he's going to destroy the cities. And Abraham says, would you spare it if we found 50 righteous people? And the Lord says, yes. And then Abraham says, well, what about 40 people? And then what about finally 10, right? And then it finally comes down to the idea that if there's any righteousness in the city, the Lord will spare it. It'll be redeemed for the sake of that, for that righteous person. And instead, because there's no righteousness there, except for Lot, then Lot is commanded to leave, and then the Lord destroys the city. So the lesson isn't so much about collective guilt. She's trying to point out that for the sake of a lack of even 10 righteous people, we experienced the horrors of the war and the final solution.
Eichmann's excuse is that everyone was doing it. I couldn't have known that it was wrong. It was the norms and the legalities of the society were such that within that context, I was doing the right thing. And I think the analogy to Sodom and Gomorrah is that one might think if everyone is a sinner in the city, you wouldn't know any better. So how can I destroy the whole city? And Arendt says what implicitly endorses that, not because of some notion of collective guilt, but just because one's existence in a Sodom and Gomorrah and being subjected to those influences and just being, one of the many who all do the same thing does not relieve one of one's moral responsibility. So it's the same sort of argument that she makes earlier in the chapter where she says, true, we have become very much accustomed by modern psychology and sociology, not to speak of modern bureaucracy, to explaining away the responsibility of the doer for his deed in terms of this or that kind of determinism. Whether such seemingly deeper explanations of human actions are right or wrong is debatable. But what is not debatable is that no judicial procedure would be possible on the basis of them, and that the administration of justice measured by such theories is an extremely unmodern, not to say outmoded, institution. So this reminds me a little bit of James. But whatever we think of determinism, psychological and social determinism for our actions, if we really want to maintain the concept of justice, we have to at the very least put that aside.
Yeah, I think we agree on the conclusion. I just sort of disagree about the reference to it.
We're then left with the question of, could we possibly even now be in a situation where there's swirling injustice, and because it's so ubiquitous, we don't know about it? And there are lots of people that claim that. They claim like our treatment of animals, or when we had very complete white supremacy not too long ago was a situation comparable to that. Or the whole talk about the U.S. is based on an economy of exploitation and military imperialism. That sounds more like the collective guilt. So that's not quite what she's talking about here. It's not just that we benefit from child labor or something that we would then be unjust, but that maybe there is just things that we actively do, things that we actively support that we don't realize are unjust, and that we have no external standpoint by which we could see that. I'm not sure what to do with that other than the sort of normal philosophical examine yourself, question everything. Are we being cruel to plants? Are we I'll at least consider that. I don't find that motivating enough to change my behavior, but the other examples I gave are definitely things that have and should influence one's thinking about potential things that could be inadvertently doing wrong.
The way you formulate it just has me thinking about the terms in which Eichmann is guilty. I mean, we were talking about the end, the way in which she does frame it in the epilogue of him being guilty without knowing he's committing a crime. And I guess a lot of the book sort of calls that into question, that his psychology is such that he is able to think his way out of it. But it's not clear to me that he doesn't know that he's part of something that was wrong. In fact, I thought that it showed pretty well that, and that this idea that there's certainly the aspect that you could be part of a culture or a society, whether it be totalitarian or whatever, that you're going along with the norms and that there's something out of whack about those norms. But like I said earlier, this idea that rounding up people and exterminating them en masse is somehow within some set of norms, is outside of norms, seems pretty accessible. That's not like drinking a lot of sugar, a lot of soda pop, right? Everybody's drinking a lot of soda pop. I guess I'll drink a lot of soda pop and, everybody gets fat. It's not what it's like.
Every time a bell rings, an angel is shot through the head, but we don't know that. So we just go around ringing bells all the time. No, it's not epistemically divorced from our actual experience in that way.
Yes. So the way you formulated the question, the debate you threw out in front of us was, are there things that we're ignoring in that respect? I think as you pointed out, the animal rights one is one that people that are strongly on that side of, farming is animal cruelty would say exactly that. There's a change of consciousness that needs to happen and that they themselves won't participate as much as they possibly can. To me, the lesson is thinking about the incremental nature of that totalitarian government. If I'm thinking about contemporary things, how does the frog get boiled in that respect slowly, such that cultural norms are changed so that you see an activity that happens and say, oh, well, it's not that much different than what happened before. And we let that go.
One prevalent frame of mind that we are all in, I think, on a daily basis that's dangerous is our embrace of the meritocracy and our embrace of the hierarchy. We actually live, if one were to reflect, in a brutal sort of hierarchy where there's lots of people at the bottom who don't get to live as well as us economically and also don't get the status and the prestige that others of us do. And of course, and then there are people on the top who get way even more of that than someone in the middle class. And we take that hierarchy for granted. So we go into work and we assume that there's a boss and then me, and maybe I might have someone under me, and that's the way things are. And we live in a society, and I think most of us, probably personally, we adulate success. We love the winners and the great athletes and the great actors and actresses and the philanthropists and engineers, whoever you're focusing on. We admire and adulate their excellence. And that's a certain kind of non-moral, in the Nietzschean sense, value, that admiration for non-moral virtues, or even for moral virtues, if they, in the case of the philanthropist, seemingly it's their morality we admire, but really it's the status, there's a certain kind of status that one gains through that, which is the object of admiration. So what I'm saying is our psychology and our society is pervaded with status consciousness. And this is something Orwell speaks to as sort of the seeds of totalitarianism. And we see that directly in Arendt's account of Eichmann. What made him so vulnerable to serving that role, which was, even though he wasn't at the very top, it was an important role in the deportation and murder of Jews, was the fact that he was from a lower middle class family and he was status conscious. And this was the one thing that gave him success and a sense of success. And abandoning it was, to use Eichmann's word, unthinkable. It was unthinkable to abandon that status rather than keep on going with it and say, well, all the terrible stuff that's going on, it's not me. I'm not the one making it all happen, and I'm just following orders and all of those sorts of rationalizations. Ultimately, on a collective level, that concern for status and prestige for Orwell manifests itself in various types of nationalisms, which, if they're taken to their logical limit, become the basis for totalitarianism. The most interesting way to look at this is that the seeds of totalitarianism, the psychological seeds, the social seeds, they are part of the fabric of our society. It's a far more subtle thing than saying, oh, there's a Donald Trump in the White House or something like that. No matter how well we're doing as a society, unfortunately, at a very fundamental level, as long as we embrace the hierarchy, as long as we embrace that structure, we're embracing something that is the sort of, again, the seeds of potential totalitarianism.
Right. So a philosophical task would be, if we acknowledge that the seeds could grow into something, to evaluate the seeds. So if you're a Taoist, you might say, well, to hell with all hierarchical thinking. I will just, in fact, if somebody puts a hierarchy in front of me, I will take the lowest rung, like, because I have so much contempt for that. Whereas the Confucian responds, no, you can't really think about virtue, again, to bring in the Adam Smith thing, without pulling on social norms. And you can try to transcend those social norms by thinking like, well, what would the ideal society, what would their norms be? But it still has to be kind of rooted in actual societies, lest you just be a loon and like acting according to some directives that just have nothing to do. Nobody else would even be able to duplicate your thinking on these norms. Like, there has to be something that is potentially objective, potentially confirmable by other people, something that you can be sure that it's not merely your private fantasy, your private language, that you can even be sure that you're adhering to the same thing over time. So there is something to be said for hierarchical thinking in general, right? Or meritocracy in general. Read your Aristotle. But what are ways that we can get the social benefits out of these things without those seeds growing in that deformed way? And I think there are other things, this in-group, out-group thinking is another related issue. Is there any sense in which we should, have a narrowed circle of concern? Is it morally proper for us to say my country first, my region first, my race, my whatever, my ethnic group first? Or is that just anything like that could lead to horrible Nazi-like behavior? So no, screw all identity politics, anything related to that. I think these are good questions for philosophy to consider. And as I think I said, that unless there were some benefits out of these kind of large-scale ways of thinking, we would not have adopted them. So probably there is some good part to save, even if we want to say that in general, historically, as a historical inevitability, something bad will probably come out of it if left unthought about.
Yeah, and Orwell was explicit about this. So if we think of identity politics as just what he calls a version of patriotism, just the desire and fealty to our particular group, however it's defined, and the desire to preserve it, preserve a certain way of life, preserve a certain kind of identity, that's all well and good. But the dark side of patriotism is nationalism, in the sense of a chauvinistic attachment to the group and the group's status and superiority and power at the expense of that of other groups. That's where one thing gets turned into the other. And so it's not just our status consciousness and the meritocracy and all those things, which are the seeds, in order to grow, they actually have to have a weird interaction with our desire for the good. That's what's so tragic about it. The weird interaction between our interest in power and status and then our interest in the good, including the well-being of our own group and the well-being of society generally, can lead to tragic consequences, where the fundamental political confusion is to think that you are out for the good of your group, but really you're out for status and power and one-upmanship and the degradation of some other group, which is your relative standard or something like that. There are lots of fascinating crossovers between this and the other political stuff we've read, not just Orwell, but say someone like Burke, and Arendt knew this. If you look at her other writing, there are also virtues to the hierarchy and there are virtues to the meritocracy. Even I'm a socialist in Orwell's sense, in the sense that I think at some fundamental moral level, one must reject the hierarchy. To be in a fast food restaurant and to look at a busboy and say, yes, I deserve to make more and have a better life than them because I went to school and I worked hard. That's people's usual rationalization. I worked hard, which is just code, by the way, for I sacrifice part of my psyche in devotion to my pursuit of status. But anyway, if you're socialist, you look at that busboy and you think they should make as much as me. They should have just as good as life as me. That's the egalitarian instinct, which I embrace. On the other hand, for a philosopher like Burke, hierarchy is an important connection. It holds society together. It relates people in important ways. And if you get rid of it, as in the French Revolution, suddenly the results can be catastrophic. And this is something in her other writing that Arendt recognizes as well. So ultimately, it's a tricky question. I'm not sure how we could prescribe a prevention system to keep us away from totalitarianism because it's such an insidious thing.
So without disagreeing with any thing that you said there, I guess I still do want to stress that I feel like the meritocracy, the hierarchy thing is just one of probably several that we could come up with, ubiquitous patterns of that we can find within our behavior, within our society that are potentially corruptible in this way. So another one that is really relevant to this reading is the simplicity of political communication, that I think that she was criticizing the trial as being political speech by Israel. And for a political message to resonate, it has to be simple. You can't actually get specific. You can't get into the specific ways in which Eichmann was and was not guilty. Like, no, he has to just be evil. He has to be so, which is unfortunate that, this trial was hours and hours and hours. Like, there was room for as much subtlety as the various questioners, as the various witnesses wanted to put in, but they wanted the conversation to be about how horrible the Holocaust is, how we have to fight back against that. And that's it. And I was very much brought to mind of I heard on the news, Kathleen Gillibrand talking about Al Franken leaving and her wanting to say, like, look, the conversation is such now that we don't want the conversation to be about the subtleties of where sexual harassment ends and assault begins and where is it okay to touch somebody. We just don't want the conversation to be about that. Fuck subtlety. It's better that he was just out of the picture so that the conversation would not be distracted by the troubles of a particular man and his particular circumstances and the details of what he did or did not do. And so that we're seeing that throughout, people dismissing actual individuals and their circumstances because we want to have an overall political agenda go forward in an understandable way. We don't want to muddy the waters. Seth or Dylan, do you have any more like modern things that you were thinking of as you were reading this that you were like, oh, that's kind of like, we haven't actually talked about Trump here?
So I'll take the bait on this one thing. When Trump was elected, I was, as expected, somewhat traumatized. And particularly when we started to see some of the anti-Semitic stuff that surged up after his election, it's easy to use the Nazi example, right? You guys know how I feel about the Nazi example as a test case, right? Or a limit case in moral examples or ethics. So I had to say to myself, all right, is America on the same path? Are all the comparisons to Nazi Germany fair or unfair, or, Trump to Hitler and all those kinds of things? And so I read a book which was recommended to me by my friend, former Reed College graduate John, and it's called The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans. And this is the book that I was going to recommend to you earlier, Dylan, is that he wrote a series of books, and this is about sort of from the late 20s into the late 30s, how the Nazis came to power and what that meant for Germany and how they organized and so on. And when you read that book, you realize how radically different the circumstances were. And at a very concrete political level, what's happening in the United States is radically different from what happened in Weimar Germany prior to the advent of National Socialism. And politically and legally, America is a very different place. But that being said, right, there are clearly threads of anti-Semitism, racism, exceptionalism, American exceptionalism that are quite common. And the challenge with reading Eichmann in Jerusalem and reading Arendt is that even though there's quite a bit of concrete information in the book, facts, as I think somebody said earlier, her general questioning of human psychology and her indictment of Western civilization, I mean, really of European civilization, makes me question, how secure things are here. And it makes me feel guilty about being more of a, sort of lefty intellectual and not so much of an organizer and activist. And I continue to struggle with my sense that I need to be politically active in order to be that conscience, be that voice of conscience, regardless of what's going on around me. The difference is, of course, that we're reinforced in our non-behavior by the fact that, ironically, the external conscience for our liberal social media bubble versus, the conservative social media bubble, if I follow the trend of all the people who are like me that I'm connected to through my educational past and my political or my work status and my social media, then I might very well be indictable for my lack of action as opposed to, or my inaction in a similar kind of way. And by the way, one other last point for listeners. When the Nuremberg trials took place, the details and the understanding of how the final solution was executed were not clear. And at the time of Eichmanns' trial, there had been quite a bit more research. And the key work of scholarship that people should refer to is a book called The Destruction of the European Jews by Raoul Hilberg. And Arendt had read that, even though it was published in the same year. She had access to it and had read that, and it does rely heavily on it. And it's an immense work of scholarship to be able to differentiate the different divisions inside of the Nazi regime and National Socialism and the Foreign Office versus the Army versus, the SS and all these sorts of things.
As a closing sort of recommendation of the book, this is probably the only thing I've ever read having to do with the Holocaust that doesn't contain any, what some might term like suffering porn. In other words, that there's horrible stuff that went on. You should have been exposed to something else that would tell you that before this. But this is really getting into the logistics, parts of that story that are neglected. Maybe for the same reason that I was just talking about in terms of we want to make this a straightforward, like we want to keep, when people remember the Holocaust, we want to make them remember the suffering of this massive group of people, of the atrocities. Whereas this work assumes that you already know what the atrocities were and is not just restricted to reinforcing that until, I didn't think I ever wanted to read another thing about the Holocaust, because everything I see or read about the Holocaust is just more emphasizing that same horrible thing. Like, yes, I know that happened. Telling me it again and giving me more of the horrible stories of individuals is not going to cause any advance in my philosophical understanding of this at all. But actually getting into some of the historical details that are not directly related to the suffering of the victims is informative. I could see myself reading several books on this history period now, knowing that it's not all just about trying to manipulate me into making sure this never happens again. That's not its only point.
Yeah, it's funny. Despite all of that, I found the book really depressing. It was very hard for me to read it. And I spent all of Christmas vacation reading it and feeling, like I said, I couldn't put it down, but it was also depressing. And I've had a lot of exposure. My grandparents, after the war, stayed in Germany for decades before they came back to the States. And they fluent in German. And when I went to my grandfather's house, it's just walls and walls of German history and lots of stuff about the Holocaust. And I was strongly interested in the Holocaust from a very young age and read a lot about it. And it's something that remains difficult. And even this, despite the fact that this book isn't, what is it, Mark, suffering porn? Just the fact of just Eichmann's character and the whole, it's hard for me to describe. So I don't know that every reader will have the same response, but I guess to finish up my closing, I just wanted to get at what she means by the banality of evil, because she got in trouble for that.
And later said she wished she did not use that term.
And I think she got in trouble because it made it sound like, I think people do want to emphasize the monstrousness of someone like Eichmann. They don't believe that deeds can be evil unless we can metaphysicalize the evil of the person doing them. And so it seems to minimize the crime, when I think for Arendt, it doesn't minimize the crime at all to say that. So here's the way she puts it in her postscript when she's defending herself. She says, I also can well imagine that an authentic controversy might have arisen over the subtitle of the book, for when I speak of the banality of evil, I do so only on the strictly factual level, pointing to a phenomenon which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to, quote-unquote, prove a villain. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all, and his diligence in itself was in no way criminal. He certainly would never have murdered his superior in order to inherit his post. He merely, to put the matter colloquial, never realized what he was doing. It was precisely this lack of imagination which enabled him to sit for months on end facing a German Jew who was conducting the police interrogation, pouring out his heart to the man and explaining again and again how it was that he reached only the rank of lieutenant colonel in the SS and that it had not been his fault that he was not promoted. In principle, he knew quite well what it was all about, and in his final statement to the court, he spoke of the reevaluation of values prescribed by the Nazi government, the reference to Nietzsche there. He was not stupid. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. And if this is banal and even funny, if with the best will in the world one cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann, that is still far from calling it commonplace. It surely cannot be so common that a man facing death and moreover standing behind the gallows should be able to think of nothing but what he has heard at funerals in his life, and that these lofty words should be completely becloud the reality of his own death. By the way, one of the things she's thinking of there is when he's about to hang, he says, "Long live Germany and Austria and Argentina, I will never forget them," because it's the type of thing you heard said at funerals, but not by the person who's dead or about to be killed, right? Because it makes no sense. He's not going to remember anything. Anyway, that such remoteness from reality and such thoughtlessness can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together, which perhaps are inherent in man. That was, in fact, the lesson one could learn in Jerusalem. So she stands by her banality of evil point, and it doesn't minimize the horror of what happened, but it doesn't also misrepresent the causes and give us that comfortable feeling of, yes, there are monsters in the world, and then there's me, and I could never do such things. It's those other people, and we just have to find those other people and imprison them or eliminate them and engage in that sort of thinking, that sort of splitting type thinking, which, of course, is the very type of thinking that the Nazis and those like them at a political level engage in when they're calling for the extermination of a people.
I did find it chilling when she referred to him as, looking at his behavior, could call him a clown, but that would be, to completely undermine the atmosphere that Israel was trying to put over. So just the banality is not just, I'll let people draw their connections to the modern day political landscape themselves from that it can still be fucking scary to be a clown in that sense. Next time, we'll be talking about John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. Our closing song is called Hiding from the Face of God by Jeff Heiskell from his now out-of-print Judy Batts 2000 album. You can hear me interview him both on my episode 5 of Nakedly Examined Music and on the most recent episode 93's end-of-year celebration. Check them out at nakedlyexaminedmusic.com. We want to hear from you. What else you want us to cover? What you thought of this discussion? Go to our Facebook group. Go comment on our blog, partiallyexaminedlife.com. You could become a Partially Examined Life citizen and propose a reading group on this book or other things by Arendt if you wanted to get other people to help you explore this further. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., etc. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Here comes the shame. We're too much the same. Is love itself not enough? We run from the light. Oh, kind. Hiding from the face of God. We're hiding from the face of God. Hiding from the face of God. waiting